Mic on? All right, we're in the home stretch. 3 sets done, 1 set to go. That pace control I was talking about totally went out the window. As soon as you start overheating, it's just survival. Obviously, there's a temptation to just slow down, but there's also just a fuck it, the faster I run, the faster this is over. Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. If it's your first time here, my name is Alec Blennis. I'm a hybrid athlete training for a sub 230 marathon while building muscle. I'm here sharing some educational tips with y'all, and this week's video is all on heat training and heat acclimatization. I'm here in Austin, Texas, getting ready for a workout. Very hot day today, and I know a lot of you guys have been struggling as well. Right now, the heat is absolutely kicking my butt. So I'm gonna share some strategies with you guys that I've used to survive my workouts in the heat, and also share some tips about using heat training to prepare for hot weather races. And later in the video, we'll talk about whether or not you can use heat training to prepare for cool weather events as well. When you train in the heat, your body makes a couple of key adaptations that are gonna help you survive those conditions and potentially even perform better in cooler weather too, which we'll talk about later. Increased sweat rate, increased blood plasma volume, and just dealing with the heat from a mental perspective. Your brain just downregulates performance when it's hot, but through repeated exposure, it gets used to it, realizes it's not as big of a threat, and allows you to perform a little bit better. However, if we only think about the benefits of heat training and focus on those positive adaptations, we might be setting ourselves up for a rude awakening when we realize there is a downside to training in the heat too, and that is training quality. You just have to slow down, and that performance drop can have very real consequences as well. So if you just jump into heat training and try to do all of your normal workouts in the heat, you may reap some of the benefits and positive adaptations, but you may suffer and see some performance decline because you're not training at the same quality and you're not getting the same biomechanical stimulus load on the muscles. So to really optimize performance in the heat and heat acclimatize like a pro, you want some sort of strategy that allows you to get the best of both worlds. How can you get some of those positive heat acclimatization adaptations while also preserving training quality, preserving biomechanical load as much as you can so that you're not seeing that performance drop? So there's an obvious trade-off between training quality and some of these heat-specific adaptations. Depending on your training timeline, where you're at in the season, when your next event is, you may want to manage this trade-off a little bit differently, and in some cases not do anything at all. One important thing to keep in mind is that maintaining heat acclimatization status is a lot easier than kind of building it up in the first place. And so when you're trying to get heat acclimatized for the first time, like in the beginning of a season, especially if you don't have any major events coming up, I think one of your best strategies in terms of modifying workouts in the heat is actually to do nothing. You're gonna adapt much more quickly if you just get out and get hot as frequently as you can. So a lot of times people will talk about doing, their easier training out in the heat and then doing intervals and stuff in the early morning or on the treadmill or applying different cooling strategies and things like that. But I think in your first couple of weeks or month of heat exposure, especially if you're not close to an event where training at peak quality is that significant, I would recommend just getting out in the heat, just slowing down a little bit, suffering for that first couple of weeks or so, because I think you're gonna adapt much more quickly. And then as summer continues to heat up and you're forced to get exposed to some of those hotter conditions anyway, even when you are waking up early, for example, I think you're gonna feel a lot better. And then you'll be able to maintain that heat acclimatization with just 3 or 4 workouts per week in the heat. And then you can confidently head indoors for some of those harder sessions, and you're not gonna lose out on that heat acclimatization status. But early season, first couple of weeks, just get out there, slow down as much as you need to, and then a bit later in the season, we'll be a little bit more specific about how we manage different types of workouts, modify training programs, etc. When you're first modifying workouts based on the heat, the most important thing you can do is just slow down, maybe reduce your training volume a little bit as you get used to the new kind of recovery demands of those sessions. There's some great heat adjusted pace calculators on the internet right now. Running Writings has a great heat adjusted pace calculator. I also use an app called MeteoPace, which has a great heat adjustment calculator in it as well. However, the important thing to keep in mind with a lot of these calculators is they're based on data that probably is biased towards people who are heat acclimatized in the first place, looking at race performances, people who have been going through heat training to prepare for hot events. If it's early season and you're not particularly well heat acclimatized, you may need to slow down even more than some of these heat adjusted pace calculators will predict. So for those first couple of weeks of heat acclimatization, I would recommend just punching in your workouts into a heat adjusted pace calculator, doing the workouts in the heat, and just slowing down as much as you need to get by. After the first 2 to 3 weeks, you'll have made significant progress in your heat acclimatization. And from there, your paces are going to start improving, and you're going to be able to start pushing a little bit harder in the heat than you could before. At that point, I would recommend a more polarized approach where we embrace the heat for certain sessions and then modify and adjust other sessions a little bit more. For your easy training, you can slow down as much as you need. What I generally find training in hot weather is that your recovery is going to be strained a little bit more. Even if you do adjust these workouts and adjust your paces, you're going to have a harder time recovering, rehydrating, or replenishing between sessions. And so keep that easy training, especially easy. Use the heat adjusted pace calculators, but don't hesitate to slow down even more if you need to, so you can continue to prioritize quality on those hard workouts. With the hard workouts themselves, there's a couple of ways we can modify training sessions to be a little bit more heat friendly. When we think about what the heat really does from a physiological perspective, obviously it's going to reduce that training output, reduce our pace quite a bit. And there's pros and cons to that. We already talked about some of those positive adaptations like increased plasma volume and those sorts of things, but that reduction in mechanical output, just the fact that you're running slower or training slower, that's putting less mechanical strain, and you're going to get less of that peripheral or muscular adaptation that you might care about. So you have two main options for adjusting workouts in the heat. One is you don't do anything. You don't actually adjust them, and there may be some advantages to this I'll talk about in a second. Two, you adjust the workouts to be more heat friendly by choosing workouts that bias some of those muscular adaptations a little bit more. What I mean by that, for example, my workout that I'm doing today, that I'm going to take you guys through, is supposed to be 4 rounds of 2,000 meters, so 4 by 2K. But instead of doing 2K straight through, each 2K is broken up into 5 by 400 meters with 30 seconds break between. That gives me just enough time to dump some cold water on my head, get a little bit of recovery so that on each of those 400-meter chunks, I'm able to run just a little bit faster. So instead of slowing down my goal 2K pace on account of the heat, I'm going to run my normal 2K interval pace, but in those 400-meter chunks with 30 seconds break between. That allows me to still get very similar mechanical stimulus. I'm still getting the same total mileage in on my legs, but I'm adding a little bit of additional rest to bring down the central or cardiac demands, thermoregulatory demands, so that the workout is then more doable. That works really, really well, especially if you have an event coming up quickly and you need to maintain as much of that race-specific pace work as possible. It also makes sense if the training you're doing is exceptionally hot, and if you didn't make any adjustments at all, you feel like your training quality would drop way too much. On the other hand, if you don't have a race coming up in the near future at all, there can be some benefits to just taking the hit, taking the loss, slowing down a little bit more, and then thinking about it from a bigger picture periodization strategy. Having some workouts that are a little bit more centrally limited by like cardiovascular factors, thermoregulatory factors, they're going to slow you down a little bit, reduce mechanical loading, and probably help you actually tolerate a little bit more volume, especially once you're heat acclimatized fairly well, your recovery is not as strained as it was early in the season. That reduced mechanical loading, reduced pace output may help you handle a little bit more volume than you could if those workouts were all at a faster mechanical pace. When things cool off a little bit in the fall, for example, you're going to have a better base of volume to pull from, and then your workouts are going to get faster and more intense. They don't necessarily have to be at full speed or at 100% all the time. So I do think there's some value in just taking the loss, training through the heat, slowing down as much as you need to. But if the conditions are exceptionally bad, training quality is just really taking a hit, I think breaking up those workouts to be a little bit more heat friendly like I'm doing today can be a really great strategy. Something that I think is important to understand about heat exposure and heat adaptation is that hotter is not always better. You don't adapt to an external temperature, you adapt to an internal core temperature. So whether it's 80 degrees or 100 degrees or 110 degrees, you're not going to start adapting to that heat until your core temperature reaches a certain threshold, and it's that internal core temperature that starts triggering adaptation. If that core temperature is not high enough, you're not going to adapt, and if it's too high, you can just run the risk of heat stroke, heat injury, and you're not going to adapt in a positive way to that. What that means is that adding additional layers or training when it's extra hot may not necessarily help you adapt any better compared to just training in moderately hot conditions. If you make the conditions extra hot and you decide to train when it's 110 degrees outside versus just 80, you may adapt to the heat stimulus of that either way. The hotter conditions just require an even bigger drop off in terms of training quality. So my recommendation, if you are trying to adapt to the heat, is make sure you're getting hot enough, but don't think that adding additional heat stress on top of that that's going to make you slow down even more is going to make much of a difference. If it's hot enough that you're having to adjust your pace even a moderate amount, it's probably hot enough to adapt positively to it. Don't think that you need to make it even hotter. This goes for outdoor workouts as well as people training indoors, adding layers of clothes, for example, doing indoor treadmill workouts with the heat suit on, that kind of thing. Hotter is not better. Add just enough heat that you might have to adjust your paces by 15 seconds a mile or something like that, and you still feel very hot by the end. Maybe your face is turning a little bit red, but there's no need to make it so hot that you're slowing down a minute per mile, 2 minutes per mile. That's probably overkill at that point and just going to cause that reduction in training quality that we don't want to see. Another adjustment I'll make when training in the heat is my training frequency and the potential use of double sessions. I think longer single sessions, like one 10-mile run in the heat, is a lot more difficult than two 5-mile runs in the heat. Oftentimes the first 5 miles of a run will feel pretty good, and it's that back half where you start to really overheat and suffer and take on a lot more recovery strain because of that. If you can split your sessions into shorter, higher frequency sessions, I think that's a little bit more tolerable when training in warm conditions, and you can always consolidate back to you can consolidate back to longer single sessions when the weather cools off a little bit. This goes for your base mileage as well as your workouts. Oftentimes, you could take 2 hard workouts per week, split it into 3 moderate length workouts per week, getting in the same total training volume of faster work, threshold work, etc., but splitting it into 3 more tolerable workouts versus trying to suffer through 2 longer ones might be a little bit more tolerable. Now, if you don't have the opportunity to train indoors or get out really early in the morning when it's fairly cool and you're doing a hard workout on the track or roads, you may need to make some additional adjustments to that session, implement some cooling strategies to survive, and I'm going to take you guys through some of those strategies today. I'm about to do that 4x2K workout I already discussed. I'm going to modify it, break it up into 4 sets of 5x400 instead of 4x2K straight through. And I have some other modifications and cooling strategies I'm implementing as well. So follow along. I'll be talking to you guys through this workout. We'll see how it goes. I'm about to start my workout. Got a 2-mile warm up, and the first cooling strategy I have for you guys is pre-cooling. I think a lot of times when people come out to train in the heat, they wait until they're hot to try to start cooling off, but you can start trying to cool off right away, and it's just gonna buy you some time. I think if I do some pre-cooling strategies, I'll probably gain an extra mile or so than I can get through in the workout before I start to really suffer. So I haven't even started running yet, but I have a cooler full of ice water. I have a sun hat to try to keep the sun off my neck. Also trying not to get sunburnt out in the heat. And basically I'm just gonna dunk my head, my hands, my hat in the ice water, put it back on. I'm gonna drink some, I got some sports drink in the cooler as well. So I'm gonna take a swig of that. So haven't even started, I'm not really hot yet, I feel fine. I'm just gonna try to lower my core temperature, a couple fractions of a degree, and then get on with a 2-mile warm up. I might even dunk my head in at the 1-mile mark, even just as my warm up, so that when I start my workout, I'm not already overheated. All right, here we go. Not feeling horrible today just yet. The sun is breaking through the clouds though, and here in Texas, I feel like the sun is almost worse than the heat or the humidity itself. One thing that some of the heat adjusted pace calculators are not good at accounting for is just like local variations in sun, wind, picking up the heat off of the turf and stuff like that. That's going to be pretty tough to account for with a heat adjusted pace calculator. So just make sure you're still auto regulating, slowing down, if you need to, all that good stuff. I've also personally found that, at least in my experience, the calculators probably over-index temperature versus humidity. Humidity is obviously included in the calculation, but I found even on some relatively cool but tropical days, when it's like 85 and 100% humidity, the calculators, I don't think, give me enough credit. Whereas on hotter, drier days, it's 100 degrees, 40% humidity. Sometimes it'll give me a huge pace adjustment, and it doesn't really feel all that bad. So keep that in mind too. Let's see what we're dealing with today. My phone's too wet and my hands are too sweaty, so we'll find out later. I think it's one of those cooler but tropical days. I'm thinking it's about 85, 86, probably 80% humidity or so. The humidity is, I think, the worst part. What I found correlates better with my performance than anything is just the dew point. There's heat index, there's wet bulb globe temperature, all that. But to me, just simple dew point has been my best indicator. It's been low 70s. Dew point's been like 72 to 74 for the most part this summer for most of my workouts. That's been pretty tough. And then about 2 weeks ago, we had some dew points that were like 80, and those almost killed me. I did a workout very similar to this 2 weeks ago. Heat index got up to 118. Dew point was like 80, 81, 82. And that workout almost destroyed me. So I don't think this one will be as bad. But getting started here, we got kind of 4x2K broken up as 5x400 for each set. Gonna be about a 30-second break between. My goal with this workout is just to work on pace control. My pacing's been a little bit erratic on some of these workouts with some like fast reps and slow reps. So I'm gonna try to be really intentional and kind of cut down rep to rep. So I got 5x400 here in the set. It's only a 30-second break, so I'm not really gonna have time to cool off much, but then after I get those 5 reps done, I'm gonna take 5 minutes or so, really cool off. We got audio. Oh man, the difficulty with humidity is your sweat just doesn't do anything. Even laying here, like the ground's probably 120 degrees. The only thing I can do to cool off is pour ice water on myself. Hope for the best. I kind of feel like I'm gonna throw up halfway through the workout. Strategy I've done on a couple workouts like this is I'll turn on my car, get the AC blasting, and then take like a 4 or 5 minute cool down break in my car. So what I think I'm gonna do to be able to get through the last set, I'm gonna get through this one as is. I'm gonna go ahead and turn my car on after I get through this third set and sit in my car for 5 minutes, think about my life choices, and then get through that last set. It's the problem, I can't turn my car on because my phone's wet. I can't turn my car on from my phone because my phone is too wet. So I think we're just gonna suffer out here. That second set was a little fast again. Ran like 73, 73, 73, 74, 75. It's not ideal, and I don't recommend doing this. Coach, if you're listening, I'm sorry. But if I go out a little hot in the workout, I don't know, it just helps me mentally to know that if I do slow down a little bit towards the end, I'm still doing okay on average. Positive splitting like that is not recommended. It's not professional advice. That's just me as a flawed, troubled human being. Mic on? All right, we're in the home stretch. 3 sets done, 1 set to go. That pace control I was talking about totally went out the window. As soon as you start overheating, it's just survival.
Obviously there's a temptation to just slow down, but there's also just a fuck it, the faster I run, the faster this is over kind of mentality as well. I'm actually ahead of pace, feel pretty decent besides the heat. My calves are actually more tired than I expected. I don't know. I feel like when it's hot, your kind of alert system, your body telling you what's going wrong is just like heightened. You feel every little thing. So I think part of getting good at performing and training in the heat is just tuning all that out. Just being there for just getting the work done kind of thing. Because it's not going to feel good, you know. And if you adjust when stuff doesn't feel good, when it's hot, you're not going to get much done. You just kind of got to suffer a little bit more than you might usually. You do want to be safe though. If you start getting the chills, sometimes shut a workout down. It's no good. That's happened to me twice this summer so far, where I kind of stopped sweating, feel kind of cold and hot at the same time. And when that happens, just call it immediately. Make sure you cool off. Make sure you have a cooling strategy available to you. The best thing you can do is cool off as soon as you possibly can. So always have, plenty of ice water, cooler, something like that, if you can. Also make sure you stay hydrated. Even if you are staying cool, if you're not drinking enough, you can get dehydrated. I got too dehydrated once this summer, was pissing blood after the workout. That is not something you want to have happen either. If that does happen, it's usually not a medical emergency. You just got to drink some water. But it's definitely not something you want to do. It can lead to some complications. For example, endurance athletes, if you get really dehydrated, that could increase your risk of like deep vein thrombosis, blood clots, etc. So it's not something you want to fuck around with. I was pretty dumb. So learn from my mistakes. If you're going to be out in the heat like this, be smart. All right, workout done. Got through 4 sets of 5x400. I think I averaged about 74 seconds a lap, so a little under a 5-minute mile. 30 seconds between laps, and then after number 5, 10, and 15, so 3 breaks. Took 4 to 5 minutes to cool off in the ice water. Feel pretty decent. Definitely pretty hot. It's a hard workout, but compared to doing a similar session 2 weeks ago, I don't feel nearly as sick. I felt like pretty wrecked after a similar session 2 weeks ago. Today, tired, definitely hard, definitely out of breath. But I could cool off, eat, take a little break, and do another run later today if I needed to. So good improvement. Feel pretty good about it. A little bit faster than prescribed by coach. But he was probably planning on me being a little bit hotter than I was. I was pretty liberal with my cooling strategies today, which really makes a big difference. If I didn't have the ice water and stuff out here today, it would have been a different ball game. So if you guys are going to do hard workouts, threshold stuff, intervals, make use of some of those cooling strategies. Consider breaking your workouts into chunks like I did today. At some point, you're going to want to get back to some longer continuous chunks. But just to maintain some exposure to faster pace running, a little bit more kind of peripheral muscular factors, I think breaking up at least one of your weekly workouts into smaller chunks but higher volume of chunks is probably a good idea, just to balance off that training quality against some of the heat adaptations that you're looking for. On a session like today, once I've gotten through the main work and I'm onto my cool down, I'm not going to cool off again right now. I'm pretty hot. I'm just going to kind of sit with the discomfort, do my cool down, another 2 miles, and then I'll cool off a little bit more after that. When you're out training, competing in the heat, obviously hydration, fueling is super important. I'm going to clear up a couple of myths, misconceptions about hydrating and fueling in the heat, give you a couple of actionable strategies so you can perform at your best. First is the idea or principle that you need electrolytes. Electrolytes are important, but I do think even in the context of heat training, they've gotten a little bit overhyped. If you're doing relatively short workouts in the heat, you're still probably not losing that much fluid volume. Obviously, longer workouts in excess of an hour, you're going to lose a lot of fluid and you're going to have to pay attention to that. But just because you're really, really hot or potentially overheating doesn't always mean that electrolytes are going to help. And if the workout is very short, for example, you have a 30-minute really hard workout in the heat and you add a bunch of sodium onto a workout when you're not losing enough fluid to require it, that can backfire. If you have excess sodium or electrolytes, that's just going to pull fluid from elsewhere into your body, into your digestive tract, potentially give you things like diarrhea, stomach ache, just not feel very good. When I look at the research myself, and to be clear, this is not pulling from any official guidelines, but based on my personal experience and looking at research directly, when fluid intake is less than about 2% of your total body weight, so for me, I'm 75 kilos, 2% of that is going to be about 1.5 liters. If my fluid intake during a workout is 1.5 liters or less, I can probably get by without added electrolytes, and it's not going to be that big of a deal. Once I start getting close to that 2% mark, and certainly above, so usually for me at about the 1.5 liter mark, I definitely want to make sure I'm getting added sodium electrolytes in with that fluid, because if you take in a substantial amount of fluid without electrolytes, you run the risk of hyponatremia, can be life-threatening, very dangerous. So make sure you have the electrolytes coming in if the fluid intake dictates it. But again, if you're outside for a short enough duration, you're getting through a 30-40-minute workout with 0 to minimal fluids, don't feel like adding electrolytes or having a really concentrated electrolyte beverage is going to help. It could even backfire. Overall, if you just think about an electrolyte to fluid ratio or concentration, that's probably your safest bet. I'll usually take in somewhere between 500 and 1,000 milligrams of sodium per liter. If you stick to that ratio, you're probably not going to get into too much trouble. Now, there is room for individualization. People will say things like, I'm a salty sweater or I'm not a salty sweater. And the most important thing I can talk about with that is that how salty of a sweater you are, etc., can be partially genetic, but it's heavily within your control and can change with heat acclimatization. If you're not acclimatized to the heat and you're not used to it, your sweat is going to be more concentrated and your electrolyte needs are going to be a little bit higher. When you get acclimated to the heat through regular exposure, your sweat will become more dilute and your relative electrolyte needs may go down. What I generally recommend for people is in the beginning of the summer, early on in your heat acclimatization progress, I would roughly double your electrolyte intake for that first 1 to 2, maybe 3 weeks, and then gradually taper off to a reduced intake. So at the beginning of the summer, when I'm first having some of my hottest workouts, I'm first noticing a big pace drop, I might use closer to 1,000 milligrams of sodium per liter of fluid, and then over a couple weeks, I'll taper off to more like 500 or so. Now, you might be wondering, why would I bother tapering off? Why not just stick to the higher amount? And the answer to that is your sweat concentration, your sodium losses, they will respond to dietary intake. If you're someone that has a very high sodium intake, whether in workouts or outside of your workouts, your body, your kidneys are going to adjust to that and you're going to have more concentrated sweat. And that can make you more sensitive to electrolyte losses during a workout. On the other hand, if your daily intake of sodium is a little bit lower, you're acclimatized or used to lower sodium intake during workouts, you might be less sensitive to some of those sodium needs. So it can be this kind of feedback loop or self-fulfilling prophecy where people who are salty sweaters, taking a lot of electrolytes, consume a lot of sodium, and that reinforces the idea that they are in fact salty sweaters. If you struggle with cramping, staying hydrated, etc. on hot workouts, what I would recommend is look at your sodium intake throughout your overall life. You don't have to go super low sodium. I'm not recommending people go like 2,000 milligrams or less. But if your sodium intake is extreme, over 6, 7, 8 grams of sodium, a lot of people, when they look, they're getting like 10,000 milligrams of sodium a day. A single element packet is 1,000, and I know people having several of those in a day. If your sodium intake is super, super high, consider bringing that down a little bit. Over time, that may help you not actually need as much during your workouts. If you're shooting somewhere in that 5,000 to 1,000 or 500 to 1,000 milligrams per liter mark during your workouts and staying hydrated, you're probably going to be just fine. Going much beyond that could certainly backfire. But again, when you're first starting, if it's your first couple of weeks, I would recommend increasing electrolytes, maybe even supplementing with some magnesium those first couple of weeks, because electrolyte losses, magnesium losses in particular, can be extra high during that initial acclimatization period. In addition to electrolytes, your carbohydrate needs in the heat can be higher too. Any hot workout is just going to bias your fuel substrate use away from fat towards carbs a little bit. The same workout at the same output is going to be more glycogen depleting in the heat compared to in cool conditions. So making sure you're getting plenty of carbs on top of your workouts is just going to help even more. Plus, glycogen, stored muscle glycogen, requires that carbohydrate be bound to water. So when your glycogen stores are higher, your intramuscular hydration is higher as well. You'll be able to get deeper into a workout relying on some of the water that's already stored alongside that carbohydrate. So you're generally going to feel better and be able to maintain hydration status more effectively with more carbs, higher glycogen concentration in your muscles as well. Last but not least, on the note of fueling, hot weather for most people is an appetite suppressant. It can make you nauseous, at worst, and even best case scenario, you might find that you just don't have as much of an appetite as usual post-training. So liquid calories, liquid carbs are especially helpful post-training in the heat. I recommend getting about 100 grams of carbs immediately post-training in some sort of liquid form like a sports drink. The faster you can get that in, the faster you can rehydrate, the sooner you're going to feel back to normal, and the sooner that appetite's probably going to come back as well. So make sure you guys are staying on top of your hydration, electrolytes, etc. Don't overcorrect or overdo anything. I think, like most things in fitness, the pendulum swings too far one way or the other. Moderate amounts of sodium are probably plenty for most people. I've got, I think, 500 milligrams in this like 30-ounce bottle, and that's all I use for today's workout. And I was out here about 90 minutes, and I'm doing just fine. Let's quickly recap my favorite heat acclimatization strategies, and then we'll talk about the big question: can heat training improve performance in cool conditions? First, when you start acclimatizing to the heat, the first 2 to 3 weeks are when you're going to see the biggest gains and the most acclimatization. During this initial phase, I recommend getting hot early and often, as many times as you can. Don't over-adjust your workouts or worry about trying to maintain training quality. Just get out there in the heat every day if you can. Over that first 2 to 3 weeks, you're going to make huge strides. Workouts are going to get a lot easier. And then from there, you can focus on maintaining that acclimatization status and then start tinkering with workouts to maximize training quality on the days that count the most. On easy training days, I wouldn't adjust much of anything other than adjust your pace using something like a heat adjusted pace calculator from Running Writings or Medio Pace. And then on your hard workout days, consider doing the same and possibly adjusting workouts with longer rest times, shorter chunks of work to maintain a little bit more of that biomechanical stimulus. Utilize various cooling strategies like pre-cooling. Make sure you stay hydrated, use electrolytes if you need to, and make sure you're staying on top of fueling throughout the day because that appetite can take a hit, and you want to make sure you're fueling adequately across the day and across the week too. If you're doing all of that, you're certainly going to see improved performance in warm weather conditions, but the big question remains, can that help you perform in cool conditions as well? Right now, the research points towards a weak no,
But I think that there is reason to believe that some of these research protocols could be improved, and you might see even better performance gains than we're currently seeing in the literature. Like we've talked about a lot in this video so far, there's a trade-off between heat acclimatization and training quality, and a lot of the research protocols that we see do allow training quality to take a hit. If you're a little bit more strategic about how you modify your training to maintain quality as much as you can, I think you could expect better results than we're seeing in studies to date. Additionally, just like altitude, there are people who respond particularly well and not particularly well. Additionally, how someone responds to one bout of altitude exposure, for example, doesn't necessarily predict how they'll respond in the future. What that means is someone could do a 6-week altitude camp, see performance gains, and then the next year do the same thing and it not work for them. I think heat could probably function similarly, and that there's going to be responders, non-responders, and you might tolerate bouts of heat training better or worse at different times in different seasons, depending on a wide variety of personal factors, such as stress. So just because you've had difficulties with heat in the past doesn't mean that you might not be successful in the future. Overall, I think periodizing heat exposure is probably the next big thing that the research needs to look at. Can we utilize dedicated heat training blocks done in very specific ways to potentiate performance, improve performance in subsequent training blocks and at very specific workouts to then prepare for a specific race? Take altitude again. A lot of people think of altitude as something you do right before a race, but for certain races like the marathon, for example, it might actually make more sense to do an altitude training block to potentiate and improve performance in your marathon specific block and then race, making that altitude exposure something you do several months out as opposed to right before. Similarly with heat, when we look at the question, does heat improve performance in cool weather? If you stack a heat training block immediately before a cool weather race, you may not have had time to get in the very specific workouts that you need at sufficient quality. But if you back up that heat exposure a little bit, do a heat training block to get some of those adaptations that you want to then potentiate improved performance at a race specific block for 6 to 8 weeks and then compete, I think that might be where we see some of the best potential gains. So can we say confidently that heat training can improve cool weather performance? No. Right now, the research at least suggests it's not harmful. And I think if you apply it very intelligently, individualize it, think about strategies to maintain performance on key sessions, and have some sort of periodization strategy, I think that future research will probably lean closer to yes than to no. If you want to include heat training in your program, but you don't have access to the lovely conditions I have in Austin, Texas today, you do still have some options ranging from indoor training with extra layers to passive heat strategies like sauna, hot tub, etc. If you're training indoors, it's pretty straightforward. If you don't have a fan cooling you off and you put on some extra layers, you're going to heat up real fast. Just remember what I said about training adaptations being triggered by an internal temperature, not an external one, and you don't need to get extra hot, you just need to get hot enough. What that means realistically inside is that if you significantly overdress so that you heat up really quickly during a workout and then shed some of the layers to maintain that level of hotness, that tends to work really well. What I'll often do inside is put on a hoodie, sweatpants, gloves, a hat. I'll run until I get sufficiently hot, feel like my core temperature is elevated, and then I'll lose like the hat and the gloves, but keep the hoodie on, and I'll just maintain that level of being uncomfortable for the remainder of the workout. Typically 45 to 60 minutes, 5 times a week is what it takes to get really well acclimatized. Once you've made it to that point, you can probably cut that exposure roughly in half and maintain the majority of the benefits. Again, try to keep your pace reduction reasonable. If you're having to slow your sessions down by more than about 10%, you've probably over adjusted. If you're utilizing passive strategies like a sauna or hot tub, remember you have to get your core temperature elevated before you really start adapting. What a lot of people will do is just they'll go into a sauna feeling cool, and it takes 15-20 minutes until they're really significantly hot. But then at that point, the sauna is so hot, they keep increasing body temperature that they can only sustain elevated core body temp for 5 or so minutes before they're now getting too hot. And so what isolated passive heat exposure usually does is it gives you a lot of time below your target temperature, and then you get to target core temperature for a couple of minutes, and then you overshoot it rather quickly. So sustained time at the ideal core body temperature is relatively small. To work around that, your best option is to get really hot, spend 3 to 5 minutes at that very uncomfortable body temperature, step out for 30 to 60 seconds, and then get back in for a couple minutes, get out for 30 to 60 seconds, get back in, so that you're able to maintain that high but sustainable elevated core body temperature for a significant period of time. Typically what we see is that adding that passive exposure on top of exercise is more effective than doing it on its own. So preferably you're gonna do some sort of workout, in cooler conditions, for example, and then finish that workout in the sauna or the hot tub. If you do that, your body temperature is already gonna be hot by the time you get in there, and then you can work on that alternating strategy, like 3 minutes on, 1 minute off for 20 to 30 minutes or so. That's gonna give you kind of the best of both worlds. I think that passive heat exposure can work really well when paired with exercise and when done strategically in that on and off manner to maintain an elevated body temperature for more minutes than you typically get with just one isolated session. If you're training for an event where training quality is particularly important, such as a shorter distance event, you're doing a mile or 5K, for example, and you can't risk much reduction in training quality, that passive approach where you do workouts in cool conditions and then apply passive sauna or hot tub exposure can be a good way to get the best of both worlds. For workouts where pace is important but not as critical to have dialed into the second, like marathon training and certainly ultra marathon training or trail running, I think a more active approach where you just get out in the heat can be sufficient and give you the amount of time in hot conditions that you need to make the most adaptation. I think both approaches can work really well depending on what event you're training for and what your timeline is or how close you are to the event. You may want to try different strategies. If you're relatively far out from an event, I think getting out in the heat, allowing your training quality to take a little bit of a hit is not the end of the world. But if you're much closer to an event in that specific block, 6 to 12 weeks out, you may want to leverage more passive strategies that allow you to maintain higher workout quality, or be more diligent about using cooling strategies, trying indoor workouts, and other modifications like that. While a lot of heat acclimatization guidelines make it seem very cut and dried, simple, like there's just one way to do it, I don't think that's the case. I think depending on what you're training for, how you personally respond to the heat, what your schedule looks like, etc., there's a lot of ways to use heat exposure to improve performance and adjust your training parameters to your individual needs. Hopefully this video gave you a good understanding of what some of your options are, and you can go out, do some heat training, and feel more confident that you're doing so in a way that's going to improve your performance in hot and cool weather alike.